My name is Chris Punongbayan with California Change Lawyers, and I'm very grateful to be able to present this webinar today. I will give some introductory comments, and then we'll hear from our two guest speakers. And then at about 12:40, 12:45, we'll leave questions for you. So if you have questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. Please note that this conversation is being recorded. So we are living in extraordinary times. It feels like we are living in a pandemic within a pandemic. More than 40 cities around the country will experience a curfew tonight. Hundreds of thousands have been protesting daily. The COVID-19 crisis has led to the death of more than 100,000 Americans, and disproportionate impacts are being felt in communities of color. I feel heartbroken, frustrated, angry, but not broken. I remain grateful for everyone in this room, grateful that we've been able to create the space to talk to two leaders for our movements for change in California and nationally, who have graciously joined us to help us understand what is going on, Zach Norris and Keith Wattley. Zach's book, which I cannot highly enough recommend that you read, sets forth a vision of a country that relies on new systems that are not based in fear and punishment, but rather love and caring. And it's the perfect entry point into the discussion that we will have today. Before we begin, I'd like to set an intentional space acknowledgement for the next hour. In this space, we value honesty, vulnerability, and how you are showing up emotionally. We value your identities. What we're about to embark on a discussion that will center the voices and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I've asked Zach and Keith to be as vulnerable as they are comfortable, and I encourage all of you to ask questions and share your own experiences as you reflect on what our speakers have to say in the chat box. And again, if you have questions for our speakers, we'll get to them. Leave the questions in the Q&A box. I also want to acknowledge that some folks in the room might be looking for some healing. Next Tuesday, June 9th, we're hosting a lawyer healing circle at 5 p.m. Pacific, and everyone, lawyer, activist, community member is welcome. This healing circle is a chance to share our struggles, release stress, and learn from one another, regardless of where we are. So I'm really happy to be introducing Zach and Keith. Zach Norris is the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and the author of We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities. And he's also the co-founder of Restore Oakland, a training and community advocacy center making a safe and secure future possible for Bay Area residents. He's also a co-founder of Justice for Families, a national alliance of family-driven organizations working to end our nation's youth incarceration epidemic. His book that we'll be discussing today, We Keep Us Safe, was released this year and has been praised by Forbes, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Boston Globe, and Kirkus Reviews. Zach is a loving husband and dedicated father of two bright daughters, whom he is raising in his hometown of Oakland, California. Keith Wattley is the founder and executive director of Uncommon Law, a legal nonprofit providing trauma-informed counseling, legal assistance, and advocacy for people serving life sentences in California state prisons. Keith has been advocating for the rights of people in prison and on parole for more than 20 years. At Uncommon Law, he is focused on helping people transform their lives and demonstrate to the parole board that they can safely be released from their life sentences. In 2018, Keith was selected as one of the Obama Foundation's inaugural fellows, recognizing his unique legal model and vision. And in 2020, he was awarded the James Irvine Foundation's Leadership Award. So thank you both for joining us. And my first question is to both of you, just to check in. How are you holding up during this crisis of COVID-19, and then also the social upheaval that's now sweeping across the country? So Zach, do you want to go first?
Sure, and thanks for having us, Chris, having me, Chris. I really appreciate this opportunity. And it is an opportunity, even amidst all of this crisis. I believe that we have an opportunity. I am feeling a mixture of a lot of emotions. I am feeling anger and frustration. I am just deeply concerned with the loss of Black people. We are dying due to COVID. We are dying due to hunger. We are dying without shelter and being told to shelter in place. And Black folks like George Floyd, who are just trying to survive, are being killed by the police. And so acknowledging that reality, just want to, hold a moment for all of the folks who are losing their lives. And I'm also determined. I'm determined because I have no choice but to be. I live in East Oakland, where the sounds of sirens are fairly constant. The sounds of gunshots and the sounds of a society that feels like it's unraveling if it was ever held together are ever present. So I'm a little bit anxious because tonight I am going to be going out with others to defy a curfew that I believe is unjust and signals an attempt by local elected officials to clamp down on protest rather than actually listening to and responding to the calls for systemic change that are obviously needed in this moment. So that's a bit how I'm feeling. Yeah.
Thank you, Zach, for being so real and being so brave in this time. Keith, how are you doing?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Before we get too far into this, I just want to say, I'm so appreciative of Zach Norris and the work of the Ella Baker Center. I mean, they've been a demand for closing youth prisons since before anybody thought it was possible, and now it looks like we may be able to do that in California. And Zach's book has really provided so much historical and contemporary context and insight for a lot of the things that I see in prisons and working with my clients, and I think context for a lot of what we're seeing in the streets right now. And I really appreciate the work that you do, Zach.
Thank you, Keith.
As for your question of how we're holding up, I think Black folks have always held up. We do what we have to do to survive, but there's this constant duality. We can be completely devastated by an incident, but we can't really afford to be paralyzed by it. Every time I see or hear about another incident in which somebody who looks like me has been unjustly hurt or killed, especially at the hands of law enforcement, it's devastating. It tells me we haven't made very much progress in this country, and it destroys any sense that I should expect much different for my family going forward, which is terribly difficult to deal with. But Black folks have always had to deal with injustice and hatred and violence. This whole country and most of the systems within it are built on that cocktail, right? And we've never had the luxury or the privilege to be incapacitated by it, to be immobilized by it. So we move forward and do what we have to do in order to make today just a little bit better than yesterday. But see, I think we've been moving on from tragedy to heartache and racism and violence, as long as we've been here. And when people ask me how I'm doing, frankly, I'm not doing so well this time. Yeah, I think we're done moving on. I think it's probably time that we moved in and we took over. I think we can't keep relying on the same institutions to produce different results. I think we need to replace both the people in charge and the institutions themselves. We need to be done with a reform agenda and work on a replacement agenda, I think is what needs to happen. And I think we're starting to hear more consistent calls for that, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Keith, for sharing. And that's really a perfect segue into my next question for Zach, because your book articulates that new future and that new system. So you talk about how we as Americans need to drastically rethink the status quo, and you implored us to move off and away from a fear-based criminal system to a care-based safety system. Can you talk about what you mean by that and how that can help us make meaning of what is happening today? Oh, Zach, you're muted.
Apologies. Appreciate that question, Chris. Just acknowledging Keith, and thank you for your work, Keith, and thank you for bringing in that context. Because I think it's important for all of us to understand the history and present day reality of this country. The consequences couldn't be clearer. The consequences are life and death. This is a country that was founded on genocide and slavery. It was built upon stolen labor and stolen land. And I think we like to think that we've evolved farther than we have, but the kind of white settler colonial mentality was the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And what I see today is people who believe that the only good government is a death government. And what do I mean by that? I mean that prisons and policing and punishment have come to be seen as the only worthy investments for government. And that is an agenda that is shared and has been shared over the past 4 decades by Democrats and Republicans alike. And so from 1980 to 2000 in California, we saw 20 new prisons built and just 1 new university. We see that on the local level, police departments continue to occupy more than the lion's share of an entire city's budget. And here in the Bay Area, even in the midst of a global pandemic, the Board of Supervisors, our county board, basically decided to give $300 million over 3 years to our sheriff's office that's been responsible for the death of dozens of Black and brown people in the last 5 years. And so these aren't just issues in particular cities or just issues in red states. These are issues countrywide, that we see a governance strategy that is predicated on fear and punishment rather than supporting communities. And if I had to boil down the book, We Keep Us Safe, into one sentence, it would be that we can't think about taking care of public safety if we don't take care of the public. And so what I describe in the book through stories as well as through anecdotes and policy recommendations is the ways in which there are a whole host of public health issues that should be dealt with through public health solutions, from school discipline, mental health issues, drug use and abuse, homelessness, violence. There are a whole host of public health issues that we could be dealing with through a public health approach, or what I call kind of a care-based approach to safety. And I think that this moment is a very poignant example of that, because for so long I had said, we had said as an organization at the Alla Baker Center, public health solutions for public health issues. We never really thought we needed to say public health solutions for a global pandemic. But if you see what the president is doing, if you see what the leadership of this country is doing, they are using it as an opportunity to do the same things they have since the founding of the country, which is scapegoat entire communities, place blame, and divide and conquer, using race as a weapon to divide us, rather than seeing that Black folks and white folks and brown folks have been suffering from a government system that doesn't prioritize our well-being and instead leverages fear to divide us and to keep us under control. And so I think that there's an opportunity to see that very clearly. And that's why these protests aren't just about police brutality. It's white folks and brown folks and Black folks all coming together, yes, to say we demand justice in this instance, and the life of George Floyd is a blessing, is powerful. We need justice, and there is a larger system behind this incident that needs to change, and we demand change now. So that's what I see happening, and some of the relevance in terms of the issues in the book.
Thank you for that. And Keith, can you reflect a little further on what Zach just shared, and also share your own thoughts to help us understand why things have reached this boiling point?
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep in mind that too often our policies are not based on the real, experiences of the people that are impacted. And the history of this country is filled with instances in which people have been marginalized and brutalized and destroyed, but for me as a Black man, I think it's important to understand what my existence is like, and millions of other people like me. Not to say I'm to be singled out, but consider for a second, some of the things that I've done my whole life just to keep people from being afraid of me, right? We've all been taught that people who look like me are to be feared, which justifies the brutality and all the rest of it. But I've done a lot of things throughout my whole life to avoid having people fear me. I act right in school. I try to wear the right clothes. That's whether at a social event, whether I'm applying to rent an apartment, whether I'm, shopping in a department store, going through life, I make eye contact and smile when I'm passing someone on the street, a white person on the street during the day. But at night, I go out of my way to avoid contact. If I happen upon a scene where it looks like a crime might have occurred, and there's a specific example I have of not that long ago. It was early in the morning. I was walking past the house where I could see that the screen from one of the windows had been removed and was leaning against the house. And as I walked past, I instantly assumed I was going to be suspected of trying to break into that house. Instantly. And I automatically started ticking through two different lists. One list was of who do I know who has bail money? Because I don't, right? And then the other list was who are the most influential white people I know who can vouch for me, who can explain to the so-called authorities that I'm a good person, that it's okay, he's okay. Like, I instinctively go through all of that. And I've never even been arrested before, right? I didn't even have to think, what should I do now? It was just automatic because I've been taught this is how it goes. So can you imagine the pain and the shame in that kind of existence? I mean, frankly, it's embarrassing to admit, because I'm a proud Black man, but I also have learned the things that improve the chances I'll make it home to my family every day, right? So if you can imagine, it's a pretty exhausting way to be, and still, what happened to George Floyd and so many others, and the impunity with which the police act in bringing all this violence to people who look like me is a clear and direct reminder that none of that exhausting stuff I go through is enough to keep me and my family safe. None of that is enough. So when the futility of that whole exhausting existence becomes clear, as it is now, then we're done playing the game. We're too tired to keep doing it. And it doesn't seem to matter anyway.
I think there's so much that we who did not grow up in the Black experience are being forced to reckon with and understand. And it's really just the deep listening that we folks who are not in the Black community need to really just be open to, because your experiences and what you both are talking about how that racism manifests in terms of like the individual mistrust of Black Americans translates into why the violence happens, not just through the police, but through all of the systems whereby people's welfare and well-being, are measured. The things that you talked about, Zach, around public health, homelessness, so on and so forth. It's really a complex web, but I think both of you have spoken to the different strands that explain why we are here. I want to shift a little bit to a concept in your book, Zach, that you talk about called hardcore accountability. What is this? And could you talk about it in the context of the criminal legal system? And then a two-parter here. How might the context of killings by police, how might hardcore accountability show up in that context as well?
Sure. I will start by saying that the criminal court system doesn't produce accountability. The system that we have tracks that same structural racism that Keith was just describing. And it is that structural racism that impacts and produces racial disparities, not just across races, but also among races. And so being a light-skinned African-American male, it is not lost to me that the darker your skin is in a courtroom, the longer your sentence is likely to be for the same set of facts, not just, again, across races, but also among races. And so my being here and being able to speak to you, I think it's not lost on me that some of the privileges that I have are partly as a result also of structural racism. And I think in this moment, we should all be thinking about what can we do as individuals to really upset this human hierarchy? Or as we used to say back around the early 2000s, how do we upset the setup, right? How do we upset the setup of this human hierarchy that has valued straight folks more than queer folks and light-skinned folks more than dark-skinned folks, has disproportionately impacted so many communities? And I think one of the ways in which we can do that is by actually taking stock of what actually makes us safe. Because the powers that be are leveraging fear to get you to buy into a divide and conquer agenda and agreement, right? So past presidential candidates have put out, the Willie Horton ad back in the 80s and said, watch out for this Black person, vote for me, and have used coded language to continue the status quo, and have leveraged fear to say what accountability looks like is being quote unquote tough on crime. And that is putting Black and brown people inside of cages. Now, if I asked you to think about the term public safety, you probably might think about prisons and handcuffs and policing. But if I asked you to just think about a time when you felt safe and just took a second to just take a breath and even just recall a time when you felt very safe, I imagine that you might remember a time when you were in and surrounded by a community that cared for you. That might be a faith community, it might be your family, it might be a group of friends, it might be chosen family. But really, safety, when we think about it as human beings, is about relationship, right? And so what I try to do with this concept of hardcore accountability is remember that safety is intimately tied to relationship, and that for eons and generations, Indigenous folks, among others, have understood that if you are actually going to hold someone accountable for the harm that they have caused, that they have to be answerable. They have to be in relationship, right? And so restorative justice is a concept that says the person who's caused harm, the responsible party, the person who's been harmed, must be surrounded by a circle of support of each of them. and then accountability plan is developed, and they have to follow through with that plan. And that to me is real hardcore accountability, because you have to face the harm that you have caused. You have to make amends for that harm. Restorative justice works. It reduces recidivism rates versus the traditional criminal court system. And it also works for victims, because victims report much higher satisfaction rates with that process. And finally, I think restorative justice has the capacity to build the muscle that we so desperately need in the society right now, and that is holding elected officials accountable. Because the systemic harms, the institutional harms of inequality, of police violence, of the harms associated with climate change are being under-addressed or swept under the rug currently by our criminal court system. And when we start to bring people together to say what happened in this situation, who was harmed, and how do we make amends for it, but also as individuals who are there supporting, what role did I have to play in preventing this from happening in the first place? Those are questions that we need to be asking and developing kind of our democratic accountability muscles to begin to hold elected officials accountable. So I think restorative justice is hardcore accountability, because it can help address interpersonal harms, as well as to begin to address some of the institutional harms that have been swept under the rug by our criminal court system.
Thank you for explaining that. For the 150 people on this webinar today, I'm sure there are some questions that have already come up for you, or that you just haven't had a chance to let us know. So please let us know if you do have questions in the Q&A box. And then if you want to comment on any of what the speakers are saying, please feel free to do that in the chat box. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to you, Keith, and look at another aspect of the criminal legal system that your organization focuses on. And I'll start off by saying that there are 7 million Americans in jail or prison, parole or probation. What did these numbers mean to you, and how did we get here? And then for those who don't know about Uncommon Law, could you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
I'll start by quickly describing a little bit what we do. As you mentioned in the introduction, we provide what we consider trauma-informed counseling, legal assistance, and advocacy for people who are serving long sentences, usually life sentences. California has 35,000 people serving life sentences, 35,000 in California alone. And those are sentences of life with the possibility of parole. So if they can basically transform their lives and show the parole board the product of that work, they may be able to come home from their life sentences. And what we do is we help them address previously unresolved, usually childhood trauma, so they can understand how their responses to those traumatic experiences led to thinking and behavior patterns that ultimately harmed themselves and harmed other people. And once they've done that, we help them explain that to the parole board. And when things work out well, then they can safely come home from prison. In most ways, so sort of to answer the other parts of your question, prisons create the opposite of accountability. Sort of like what Zach was talking about is but the use of prison replaces the opportunity to resolve issues by the real stakeholders in the community, and puts the reins of punishment into this third-party state actor that has very little connection to that community and its members. It doesn't serve crime survivors any better than it serves those who commit crime. We've divested from communities, especially Black communities, while investing heavily in law enforcement, from the police all the way through the prison system. And as a result, we've got too many people being arrested and put in jail and prison for things that don't require that kind of response, like unpaid traffic tickets and citations, misdemeanors, unpaid child support, even felonies shouldn't always lead to incarceration. Police as the first responders are the result and a reflection of a backward system. We shouldn't be looking for for alternatives to incarceration. We need to make incarceration the alternative that's rarely used and only used until we can find a better solution. This state, California, spends $13 billion every year on its prisons, but still can't figure out how to release elderly and sick people from prison to save them from this pandemic. Of course, the victims, as they always have been in this country, are overwhelmingly Black and brown, just like most of the negative stuff that this country has to offer. We've spent, the past 5 decades or so creating all these ways to lock more people up for more reasons at younger ages and for longer periods of time. It's been really a systematic way to disconnect people from their families, from their communities, weakening their stability, their economy, their political power. And we are seeing in the streets that people are reacting in ways that we haven't seen for a long time. And my hope, and frankly, my expectation is that we will find a way to harness this energy, this anger, this rage, in a way that results in a different future. We're not going back to normal. Normal didn't work for us. So I think we're going to reject that.
Zach, you wrote in your book, the further apart we become as a society, a nation, a neighborhood, and family, the greater opportunity there is for hurt and harm to occur. When we come together, hard though it may be, we increase the likelihood of resolving conflict. When we separate, there is no such opportunity. Can you talk a little bit more about what you meant by this and how it might apply to today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best way to answer that question is actually to tell a story. I want to tell the story of Richmond, California, right around the turn of this century. In 2005, Richmond had one of the highest per capita murder rates of any city in the country. The city council was like up in arms. They had declared a state of emergency. The police believed they knew the 30 or so people who were responsible for over 70% of the homicides in the city of Richmond, but for whatever reason, they didn't believe that they could make the case. And so city council was convening and bringing people from across the country to talk about what do we do to respond to this increase in violence. And Devone Bogan, who was then working at the Mentoring Center in Oakland, as I understand it, said, I want to bring a mentorship program to the city of Richmond and involve these predominantly young men who the police have identified. And you can imagine the kinds of pushback, because people were like, you want to do a mentorship program? But I think the city, having tried a lot of the other so-called tough on crime strategies, were willing to try something outside of the box. And Devone and other folks who have been formerly incarcerated developed a program where these young men were involved in this fellowship. But before the fellowship even began, the first thing he did, and this is critical to your question, is he brought these young men into one of the nicest rooms overlooking all of Richmond. And this is at the city government building, right? So you can imagine some of the fear associated with these young men in terms of going to this city agency, right? And going to City Hall effectively. In terms of like, might they try to arrest me when I get there? Like, what's really happening? But because he had worked with some trusted messengers in the communities, they came and they heard him out. And he said to them, everybody is up in arms about violence in Richmond. And yet no one has asked you what you think the solution is. And so I want to engage you in this fellowship process and engage you as participants in this solution. And here's what I'm going to provide. I'm going to provide a monthly stipend, daily mentorship, as well as travel opportunities. And this idea, as I said, got a lot of pushback, but the young men were like, we'll give it a try. And very early on, reporters caught wind of this and they're like, wait, Devon Bogan, are you saying that you're, paying young people not to shoot each other? And got a lot of heat. There was actually a fight that broke out and there was some response to that. But over time, the success of this program were obvious to everyone who was paying attention. Over a 7-year period, crime was reduced, and homicides in particular, by some 70%. And this was a huge deal, not just for these young men, but also for the city of Richmond as a whole, as grandmothers were able to take their kids to the neighborhood park, shops were able to stay open longer. And it really was, to me, an indication of what it looks like when we see people who have been marginalized for so long as part of the solution, as opposed to just being part of the problem. And that, to me, is an example of what it looks like for folks to come together around community safety solutions that recognize all of our humanity, right? Because the police have portrayed these young men as the problem. The city council had done the same. But when folks started to really take and invest in this program, it was with a different eye towards understanding that these young people and the communities that they came from and come from could be part of the solution. And ultimately that made a huge difference, not just inside of those communities, but again, for the city of Richmond as a whole. So I think it's possible, but it's certainly difficult, given, all of what we see in terms of the rhetoric coming out of the White House and the way in which that trickles down in terms of the behavior of police, the behavior of our local elected officials. But it is very much possible for us to come together around safety solutions that actually work for all of us.
That's a great example of how community coming together and finding the solutions, that really work to address these issues that seem intractable. The leadership is there if we just listen to the right people.
Right.
I want to ask one more question to you, Keith, before we turn to Q&A. So in your work at Uncommon Law, your clients have faced so much trauma from their experiences in prison. What have you learned about trauma and also about human resilience?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you ask it in that way. One really important thing for people to get is that the overwhelming number of people in prison suffered from unresolved and unacknowledged trauma long before they ever ended up in prison. Prison adds a whole new layer of that, as does coming home from prison, whole new layers of trauma. But they experienced that long before they went there. And among those in prison for violent crimes, almost without exception, they were survivors of violence before they ever committed violence against someone else. That's a really important thing to understand and to recognize that our prisons are not responsive to that. Our prisons exacerbate that. And so a lot of our work is helping people address their trauma histories in a way that leads to different responses going forward. And I think what we're seeing in the streets today is a societal response to multi-generational trauma that has never been addressed, never even been acknowledged. I mean, we see anger. Many of us who do this work, we understand anger as a secondary response. Usually comes after fear or neglect, or maybe it's actual physical or emotional or economic harm. And Black folks in this country have always been the victim of those kind of harm. And the anger we see is a response to that. It all makes sense.
No, thank you for that. I mean, there's, like I said, there's so many layers and interrelated forces that are causing what's happening to bubble up today. But I think you've both given some great background and history to help us make meaning. And so I want to transition now to some questions from our participants. And so our first question is from Joanna. She says, "Thank you so much, Zach and Keith, for leading the way. Are you making any demands on the city of Oakland right now to divert at least some amount from OPD and invest in housing, RJ Center's Community Solutions. How can we build on the momentum of this tragic moment and the current uprising to push for structural change in our city and state?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, because we know that this global pandemic is causing uh, a Great Depression like economic event. We are seeing unemployment levels not seen since the Great Depression. And we absolutely need to push for a rebalancing of our local government priorities away again from like a fear-based approach to safety to actually caring for one another and providing some of the basic human rights that you mentioned in terms of housing, in terms of employment opportunities. And so, yes, we're absolutely pushing for a reinvestment of resources at the local level. We are calling attention and supporting the demand of the Black Organizing Project, which has called for an abolition of police in schools in Oakland, and really pushing the school board to say, we can't actually move forward permanent, you shall not move forward permanent school closures, right? This is a public health issue for teachers and students, that if they continue to permanently close public schools, which has disproportionately impacted Black and brown students, that they will be, my children and other parents' children will be physically closer to one another, which goes against the physical distancing guidelines, that we need to keep schools open, and that we need to cut the entire school police department budget. So that's one of the ways in which at the city of Oakland, within Alameda County, we're also pushing for the Board of Supervisors to rescind their decision to give carte blanche $300 million over the next 3 years to the Alameda County Sheriff's Office, which has been responsible for dozens of deaths here in Alameda County. We know that they're already planning cuts to social services. And so we're saying if there are any cuts, they first need to come from the Sheriff's Office, which has been unaccountable in every single regard, whose office has retweeted the alt-right and really been a bulwark against accountability, if anything. So those are some of the ways in which we're really pushing for a reinvestment agenda here locally as the Ella Baker Center, in partnership with a lot of allies.
And Chris, the only thing I would change or add to that is the push can't just come from families and people in the community. If the elected leaders are not willing to demand these changes that Zach just so beautifully laid out, we need to replace them. There's no two ways about that. We should stop playing around with this. These are strong, important recommendations that need to be followed, but it can't just be the people out in the community, in the streets. It has to be the elected leaders, or they need to be replaced.
The next question is outside of the election cycle. How else can community members pressure the DA's office to support restorative justice programs?
Keith, I have a thought. I guess I'll jump in first, since I already.
I'm eager to hear your thought.
Okay, I took myself off mute. So the first thing I would say is get involved. Urban Peace Movement is doing some amazing work to hold the district attorney accountable here in Alameda County. I think you're absolutely right that there are a number of restorative justice interventions for youth and adults that should be employed in Alameda County. One of the interesting things for me is I've seen some research that shows that just across the pond in San Francisco, they are using restorative justice for a wider array of cases and seeing even better results, including, and this goes to Keith's earlier point, that they're using restorative justice including in instances of violence, acknowledging that most people who perpetrate violence have been through violence themselves. And so restorative justice is an opportunity to end that cycle and actually heal that harm. And so our district attorney in Alameda County should be looking at what San Francisco is doing, and frankly, San Francisco should be moving further than it has, and leveraging this moment to say we don't need a continuation of cycles of violence and incarceration and police violence being a part of that cycle. We need to actually move towards real accountability, and that means adopting a restorative justice approach for individuals and moving the district attorney to accept a broader suite of cases. But also, it means doing some things like they did in Chicago, where there was a reparations campaign after decades of police violence in one particular precinct and frankly, police torture. There was a reparations campaign that said, moving forward in Chicago public schools, we will talk about what happened in this precinct. We will acknowledge the decades of torture that happened to predominantly Black men in the city of Chicago, and we will provide reparations to family members and victims of that horrendous treatment. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we should be pushing the DA around individual harm, but we should also be pushing, and to Keith's point, demanding that elected officials really acknowledge the systemic harm that has happened to communities of color right here in the Bay Area.
The one bit I would add to that is that when you go to court, or even when I'm in a parole hearing with a client, when a representative from the district attorney's office introduces themselves, they say, I'm here representing the people. And I'm looking around, what people are you representing? They say that when crime victims have said, look, the DA doesn't even talk to me anymore. They don't actually know what I need to heal. They don't actually know what kind of help I need. Or even worse, if a victim of even a violent crime, even the victim's family, when there's been a murder, if they've chosen, you know what, we recognize this guy, when he committed this crime, he was 16 years old. He's now 50. We see the work that he's done to change his life. We've forgiven him, and we want to see the positive things he does going forward. The DA still opposes parole. Now, who are they representing when they do that? Certainly not the people most directly impacted by the crime. The person's already not a risk to public safety if they're released. I think that having them understand the real impact of their decisions on this process and all the people who are affected by it would lead to more informed decision-making, more informed policies that actually better reflect the needs and interests of crime survivors and people who perpetrate crimes and all the family members on all sides of it.
Mm. So thank you for our audience for asking those questions. You still have time for a few more. I did want to ask one question. Given that we have over 150 lawyers and allies who are on the call today, is there something specifically that you want to tell lawyers to do about the current moment, whether now, during the protests, or when and if the protests die down? What would you want lawyers to be doing to address some of the things that you've been talking about?
One of the things that we focus on in our work is helping our clients tell their own stories, often for the first time, because they've lived their lives with other people, labeling them and relating to them as if those labels are who they are. And that happens through the criminal legal proceedings also. Lawyers speak for them and try to tell their story. Here's why this should happen and that shouldn't happen. When they're in prison, someone else has labeled them and they don't even ask them their stories. But I think that when we get closer to our clients, understand their existence, we're much better, much more effective advocates because we get out of the way and we help them tell their own story. And those stories are the ones that sort of touch the minds and hearts of the decision makers more than a legal argument in a lot of cases, in most cases, in my experience.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And building off of Keith's previous comment, I think having lawyers connect with folks like the Alliance for Safety and Justice, Californians for Safety and Justice, that have been organizing survivors of crime and really pushing forward and calling for policy reform that really shows that, as their research has shown, that most survivors actually want to see rehabilitation. They actually want to see a justice system that supports people making amends and then going on to do better things with their lives, not a system predicated on fear and punishment. So I would say to lawyers, connect with organizations like that, connect with the National Lawyers Guild that is providing direct support as these protests are unfolding in cities across the country. Connect with folks like Law for Black Lives and Marbury Stolley Butts. Connect with Purvi Shaw, who's doing amazing work, really connecting lawyers to movements and helping ensure that lawyers support movements and don't act in ways that contradict the social movements that are being built, and frankly need to be successful for us to see lasting change.
And Purvi Shah is with Movement Law Lab.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions that have come in. So a question for each of you. Zach, how much are you seeing local governments implement or fund GED or degree programs within the prison system? And then Keith, how do or did you explain this social unrest to your children? I know a recent father that asked my opinion because his half-Black son is now 2, and I have no idea how to address that talk.
I'm going to jump in on the second question and ask for Keith's assist on both questions, if that's okay. I know of some past movement to try to reinstate Pell Grants at the federal level around education in prison. With my family, we go to protest together, and we have been participating in bringing our kids to protest since immigration marches. I remember bringing my daughter to a protest as an infant, and obviously at this moment, we have to think about safety and be mindful, and we're not bringing them to protest currently. But I think for us, it's something that we feel like they see in different ways anyways. And with a president who is so intent on scapegoating and using violent language, it's hard to avoid the way in which our society is structured. So we try to have honest conversations, but also conversations that are tailored to their ages. My kids are 8 and 10 at this time.
And I would say, I don't know enough about what happens in terms of educational opportunities at a local level for people who are in different detention facilities, but I know at the state level, as I said, California spends $13 billion on its prisons, and very little of that goes towards educational programs. This is true of other kinds of programs in the prison also, that we talked about the needs of people who had experiences with trauma. The prisons are not responsive to that. To the extent they provide self-help therapeutic programs, they largely depend on outside service providers to do that. It's not a core function of how our prison operates. And right now, none of us are allowed to go in prison. So those programs are not happening. People are just sitting. And that will be like that for the foreseeable future. It's not a commitment California state prisons have made, not as a core function of how they operate. As for how I talk to my kids, I try to be as open as honest as possible. And it's difficult because my son's the age that Tamir Rice was when he was killed, and he got invited to one of these Nerf gun parties. Tamir Rice was killed because he had a toy gun in a park. All the thoughts and fears that go through my mind with things like that, almost on a daily basis, are the reason that I recognize something has to change. Because I don't want him worried about his son the same way I'm worried about him.
We have two last questions, and I'm going to combine them, and then we'll have closing comments from either of you, and then we'll finish up. So the last two questions that I'm combining are from Mercedes and Martha. Thank you all so much for all of your work and passion. While I do agree that we need to defund the police, it seems to me that that's too big of a step for us as a country right now. What do you think is the next step as a society in terms of public safety? And then the next question was, have you considered what a restorative approach to police system violence would look like?
Yeah, I think the example that I gave in Chicago is indicative of the kinds of institutionalized approach to addressing harms by the police over decades in terms of a real reparations campaign. And I think that this country, like South Africa, has a history of racialized apartheid that continues to this day, and we need systemic solutions to that. That looks like, police institutionalized restorative approaches on a city-by-city police level, as well as nationwide approaches to really pushing forward campaigns that will address the long history of racial injustice in this country. And I absolutely disagree that defunding the police is a step that we cannot take at this moment. I couldn't disagree more strongly. I think this moment is really a critical juncture in the history of this country, because for the past 40 years, every time a hospital was closed, every time a school was closed, every time we cut a social welfare program, guess whose budget never got touched? The police departments. Guess whose budgets continued to increase? The police departments. Guess who continued to get laptops in their vehicles while we had no laptops in our schools? The police. Guess who continued to get more and more militarized weapons? Police departments. And so this is an issue of local accountability, regardless of what the federal government does, that we can demand that our local budgets be balanced towards life rather than death. That we can demand that as these cuts, if they do happen, that they be balanced in favor of the social programs that we know actually make communities safe, that we cut schools last, that we cut our healthcare services last. And so it isn't a far off demand, partly because there is this global pandemic happening right now, and every single city, every single county is going to be having to make hard choices about what they fund and what they defund. And so it is a matter of political will that those choices, as they are being made, prioritize the life of communities that have been marginalized and oppressed in this country. So I'll stop there.
And what I would add, that was one of not much to add, except for the fact that I like Zach, I disagree with the notion that declaring an end to defunding police is too much to ask. And I borrow from the prison abolitionists, who one of whom, the late Rose Braz, was really clear in saying, look, if we want it to happen, we have to declare it now. We have to name it, or it will never happen. And we need to start saying it. We need to start naming it and making it happen. The last thing, just to take a quick opportunity the reason I'm hopeful is because some of my favorite people in the whole world are those that we labeled as super predators back in the 90s, frankly. We shipped them off to prison for life. Some of them spent decades in solitary confinement. So because I've personally seen who they become and what they can create when given the opportunity, I know that a reinvestment in Black and brown communities will lead to meaningful change for all of us.
I'm sad to say that we're out of time, but I just wanted to thank both of you for really being a light in this darkness, leading with your values, and just being clear on what we need to move out of this moment and make progress as a society and a country. I highly recommend all of you go buy this book. And Zach and Keith, is there any websites or any last minute things that you want to share with the audience?
No, thanks for the plug. You can get the book at zachnorris.com, Z-A-C-H Norris.com. And thank you, Chris, for pulling us together. Thank you, Keith. As always, wonderful being in conversation with you both.
Same here. Thank you. And yes, buy the book, please. And
All
read
right.
it.
Thank you all. And just a reminder that next week we'll be holding a lawyer healing circle, 5 p.m. June 9th. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Stay strong.